Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show. My guest for this episode was Dr. Jenny Thatcher from the University of East London, aka the mischievous sociologist, as she is known on Twitter. This is a really interesting, fascinating interview with Jenny. In the first half, I talked to her about her own upbringing and how she became a sociologist. It certainly wasn't the usual route. Her attitudes towards education when she was younger and how she actually got into the subject, really interesting and fascinating. And then in the second part, I talked to her about her own ethnographic research. Again, fascinating stuff, particularly what she's attempting to do at the moment during these strange times. So without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Do you want to start by introducing yourself, please?
Okay, so my name is Jenny Thatcher. I'm a sociologist who I would say works inside and outside of academia, as well as working in many kind of non-sociological jobs. At the same time as being a sociologist. And I find that doing this leads me to apply my sociological knowledge within these positions, both in terms of navigating the environment and my role, but also using this experience to produce what I'm doing at the moment, workplace ethnographies. So recently this week as well, I started a blog series called Sociologists Left to Their Own Devices, and I've given myself the nickname of mischievous sociologist. And I would like to think that it's in the nature of every sociologist to be mischievous and cause trouble by questioning the way that society works, and revealing that which is hidden. So the aim of the blog is really to produce short, accessible pieces of writing on a variety of topics, including current issues, as well as share my own sociological research, making it accessible and freely available. And so maybe just a bit of the background. So for the last 4 years, I've been an events manager for the Sociological Review Foundation, linked to the Sociological Review Journal. And more recently, as I said, my research interests have kind of focused on taste, aesthetics, labour, gender in the service sector, and using participant observations to explore these workplaces. And so I'm just thinking of the audience. So if people don't know what participant observation is, it's a type of data collection method typically used in qualitative research and ethnography. It's a type of methodology which is employed in many disciplines, but particularly anthropology. And its aim is to gain a close and intimate kind of insight into a given group of individuals. So I use this method to explore, I've used this method to explore my experience of being a bridal shop assistant. And before coronavirus broke out, I was doing an in-depth participant observation of a pub. And these types of research interests have been inspired by my previous experience before becoming a sociologist, of working in shops and working in salons and working in those kind of service sector jobs. So that's just a little bit about my background there.
Great, thanks Jenny. And before we go into some of the more recent stuff that you're doing, I'm quite intrigued to know where it all kind of started for you. When did you first venture into sociology?
Yeah, so I mean, that's interesting in itself, because I always think that's a really good question to ask people, like why did you choose sociology? What made you want to be a sociologist? So I didn't study sociology for GCSE. It was an option. I could have done it, and I do wonder sometimes what might have happened if I did do it, because I left school at 16 years old after my GCSEs, and I didn't do A levels. I actually detested school. So much of my experience at school I felt was symbolically violent, because I was a working class girl. I was on free school meals. I had a very turbulent upbringing, caring for a mother who was schizophrenic, and dealing with a father who was actually a heroin addict, and he was in and out of prison, and I'm dyslexic.
Wow.
So I hated school. And I mean, for those, again, I'm just trying to explain what symbolic violence means. So it kind of describes a type of non-physical violence. And so I suffered a lot of stigma because of my background, because of my parents, because of my class. And I couldn't wait to leave school. I remember having a calendar and like crossing off the months. Like I couldn't wait to go. And so after leaving school, I worked in a number of jobs, from clothes shops. One of my first actual jobs was an event assistant for an event organizer. And I did this while I was at college, and I was training to be a beauty therapist. And so after that training, I would go on and I would work in beauty salons for, I guess, around 7 years. So quite a while working in salons. And I guess it just happened one day. I just thought, do you know what? I think about the kind of, I'd watched Educating Rita the other night. Yeah. And I think about that moment when her mum says to her, there's got to be better songs to sing than this. And I think that was my kind of moment. And I thought, I'd love to go back in. I'd love to do something else. Like, I hated school, but actually I liked learning, and I want to know more. I want to know why things are the way they are. I want to know why someone comes into my salon and treats me so terribly when I'm doing a personal treatment because I'm working class, so this is what I was thinking. And so I did. So while working as a beauty therapist, continuing to do that, I enrolled at my local college, and and so part of it was mainly, it was like academic, it was adult, like kind of learning skills. Because I'd left school in the 90s and I didn't know how to use a computer. I didn't even have an email. It sounds insane now, but this is what my situation was. Yeah. So I was learning all these skills, but part of it was I got to do like a 2-hour option, and I chose sociology because I thought, I can do that. And I didn't know what that was going to lead to. So if I could go back, I think sometimes would I have chosen sociology? But so kind of, I think it must have been 6 weeks into the course, that I realised at this point there was no returning back. There was no going back to being a beauty therapist, because once you've kind of developed this sociological imagination, which C. Wright Mills talks about, you can't unlearn that. And so as sociologists, I think we do become, and I do get criticised for this, as being the kind of most cynical, skeptical, critical person. You take the fun in that. You take the fun out of everything. We can't watch a reality TV show or Question Time without like shouting at the television. So so as I said, so I did that, and I went on and I did an access course. I thought, I want to go to university and I want to do sociology. And during this access course, I was introduced to Bourdieu, and I will pronounce that incorrectly. And his 3 forms of capitals, which is cultural, social, and economic. And everything suddenly kind of started to make sense for me. So I kind of understood, okay, this is why I left school at 16. This is why I felt completely inferior and like kind of violated every day of my life as a working class woman. I understood, now I understand why I feel like running away from academia so much of the time. Why people snigger when I pronounce Bourdieu incorrectly at conferences. So I think reading Bourdieu made me stay within education, because I thought, actually, this isn't right. This isn't right that we experience this discrimination, this symbolic violence, and we do have a right to education. We do have a place, and actually our voices are important, because we can understand something. We can understand social class inequalities. So how did I go into sociology? So after doing the access course, I enrolled in my local university, even though I was told, and this is what I hate this league table system of I think it's horrific. But I enrolled in London Metropolitan, and I was told, you can go to this university. No, I thought, no, it's just down the road. And now I know, because I've studied educational inequalities, I understand why people make those decisions as a working class person, but I don't regret it at all, because I don't think I would be here if I hadn't gone to London Metropolitan, because I had such a wonderful experience with my teachers and my lecturers. Yeah, and it was part of that experience of doing the degree that a number of lecturers said to me, look, you need to think about going on and doing a PhD. And this was incomprehensible to me at the time. I thought, no, I can't do this. But I did. So I went on and I did an MA at the University of Essex on sociological research, and I ended up winning a scholarship to do a PhD at the University of East London. And so when I think back about that girl sitting in that classroom at 16, 15, watching that clock while the teacher was talking, because I couldn't wait to run out the doors. Yeah. And now, like, I have a PhD, now I have a book. Now myself, I've been a teacher, and it's hard to imagine, but yeah, coming all that way, I guess.
Well, I was going to say, does it still feel weird, Jenny? Because I noticed, for example, at the very beginning, you didn't introduce yourself as Dr. Jenny. Does it still feel weird that you're within academia like that?
So I have Doctor on my Twitter, and I think it took me about 3 years to put that on now on my Twitter, on my social media account. Yeah. And I did it as a feminist. I did it as a woman. But still very uncomfortable for me to use that title, so much so because I always feel like a fraud anyway for having a PhD. I can't believe that even happened. But then I guess there's another part of me that, and this is working in the other side of academia, working, I guess, across the glass. Is that, I don't know if that's the saying, but like, being an administrator for quite privileged, quite renowned academics that maybe have not experienced inequalities at the same level that I have, and how like a use of a title can be used in quite a violent way against other people, and I don't like that. So yeah, I don't use my title, and I know I should. Even my supervisor Derek Robbins said, when are you going to start using your title? I've used it as a feminist, and I think that's the only way I've brought myself to use this at the moment. But it's still very hard for me to use that title. That's
interesting. And I wondered, do you feel that you've changed in terms of persona or accent or anything like that? Because often I think, being in academia is sometimes kind of a performance compared to our upbringing.
Oh, well, absolutely, yeah. I guess it is. And I guess I think that's maybe more to do with, like, it could be to do with who you're surrounded with, your reading. So your vocabulary expands a lot more. But you see how this plays out. So I can go and visit my friends not now because it's coronavirus, but before I could go and visit my friends that I'd grown up with, and my accent would change completely. And then like they'd hear me on the phone, and they would say to me, like, I'm not going to swear, but what the F's wrong with that? I was like, I was just speaking to this professor about this event, and it was like, So it does, I think, and you do it unconsciously, but it was, I was interviewed for someone doing research on what it is to be a working class academic, and the accent thing did come up a lot. And I think there is at one point during your kind of journey into academia as a working class person, where you do try to fit in because you think this is the only way to be successful. You're insecure, you try and hide who you are. And actually, do you know what, when you actually come to the point where you say, okay, I'm going to accept myself for who I am, I'm going to accept who I am, I'm going to accept where I come from, and I'm still a good sociologist, it's a really liberating experience. But actually, it will have its downfalls because academia might not be as welcoming to you. And I guess that's one of the problems.
Yeah. I know some people kind of embrace it, don't they? I'm just thinking of someone like Lisa McKenzie, who's sort of openly overt about her working class roots. Do you feel the same when you're teaching?
I think I've come to the point now where I have done that, but for a while I did try to hide it. Especially I guess the trauma that I've experienced as a childhood, in my childhood as well. But yeah, now I think I embraced it because it's almost, I think it's a way of saying, actually, do you know what, these are my experiences, and actually I can go into these areas and I can do this. And I think about my, current research now, like working in, well, when it was open, working in a pub, being a barmaid, and I can do that because I've got years of experience of being a shop girl, of working in a salon. I can do, and I fit in straight away, But I think of some sociologists that I know going in and trying to do that, and it makes me laugh to think about them. They couldn't do it. And then you hear about, like, I'll read research on different aspects of workplace ethnography where they've done, I don't know, like 16 hours or something. Like, they haven't actually gone and physically worked in those places. And I think there's a difference. And that's why I always kind of push for participant ethnography, because when you actually have that experience, that real lived experience of those environments, I think it opens up a whole different type of, I don't know what it is, insight into the issue, the topic.
So Jenny, you already mentioned C. Wright Mills and Bourdieu. Was there any other sociologists that really kind of inspired you when you were doing your academia?
Yeah, so I'd have to say it would be Diane Ray, who's a professor at Cambridge. And I came across her work in my degree because she uses Bourdieu in her research on educational inequalities. And what I like about her is, when I read her work, she really captured the experience of symbolic violence in education. But she's also spoken very openly about her working class childhood and growing up in a council estate in a mining part of Derby, and how she was told kind of girls like her don't go to university. So I'd have to say that was one of my biggest influences during my degree. And also, I hope I pronounce this correctly, but Elia Anderson, who's an urban ethnographer. Again, I came across him during my degree. He's most notable for writing a book called Codes of the Street, where he talks about how inner city Black America is often stereotyped as a place of random violence, and how individuals' ability to command respect within these environments is often based on an unwritten set of rules. And it's something I recognise immediately as coming from London, that kind of the different kinds of codes that operate. And I was actually really lucky to attend an ECR workshop with him at the BSA annual conference in 2013, where he spoke about the symbolic violence and the feelings of not belonging to academia. And often this would take place at kind of Yale wine receptions. So even though he was a professor there, he said they would say there would be some comment and it would lead him back to feeling, I'm from the plantation, because he said he was born and grew up on a plantation in America. So that was really poignant to me. And again, I was really lucky to hear him talk at the ESA, that's a European Sociological Association conference last year in Manchester. And he spoke about kind of subtle forms of discrimination that you can experience. And when these happen, you know, as a person, exactly why it's happening and what's happening, but it's hard to really point out and call out or tell anyone. And so one example that he gave was him travelling on a train in the USA, where the carriage became more and more crowded. But despite him having an empty seat next to him, no one sat next to him, despite, even when they had to stand. And, you know, this was about being a black person in America. And it was very moving. And I think it's anyone who's ever experienced any type of discrimination can kind of relate to that. You know, it's something that you could tell someone and they'll say, "No, you're just being paranoid," but I think that really stood out to me. And my very last one, I just have to mention, is, and I hope I pronounced this correctly as well, Alvin Goldner. So I actually came across his work, which was a big book, massive book. It's like a doorstopper, called The Coming Crisis of Western Sociology. And I think it was written in 1970. And it was after my university at London Met were clearing out a load of old books that hadn't been used or they were too old to be used. And I picked up a load of books, and I that was one of the ones I picked up. And I found it a very awakening experience to read, because what he argued in it is he argued that kind of sociology needs to turn away from producing objective truths, and they need to understand the subjective nature of sociology and knowledge and how that's kind of bound up with time and space. And so he kind of argued that the whole attempt of doing objective sociology was because it was trying to maintain a status quo. And so I think that's the first point where I realised, oh, actually, do you know what? It's okay to be outspoken, and it's okay to use my lived experience. And it was a very awakening experience. So yeah, I just have to say that. But lastly, very lastly, I have to say, after 10 years of organising academic events, often the most inspiring research can come from postgraduate researchers or early career researchers who are often doing very innovative topics using methodology. And I would always recommend looking at new and up and coming sociologists as well, because it's a good insight into sociology.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you very much for that, Jenny. That is going to be the end of part one. In part two, I'd like to talk to you about your own ethnographic research, starting with your research in a bridal store. Welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show podcast. I'm talking to Dr. Jenny Thatcher from the University of East London. Jenny, we're going to talk about your own ethnographic research, starting with your research in a bridal store. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so what happened after I submitted my PhD, I couldn't find a job in academia. And I desperately needed money. And this is something this is what it is to be a working class academic. We don't have the bank of mum and dad to rely on. Things like that. You need money. So I looked at anything. And I found a job actually in a very high-end bridal boutique. And I had no experience at all of selling wedding dresses. I'd applied for a position as being a receptionist at the adjoining beauty salon, but they said, send me a CV, and I sent it. And I realised after what had happened, they'd seen that I'd had a PhD, and this is how I got this job at the time for £7.50 an hour, by the way. Working in this boutique. And so what I did, so I kind of just started off as, I need money, let's keep applying for academic jobs. And then I realised very quickly, even though it was a very high-end bridal boutique, there was a social kind of classification of the customers in terms of choosing their dresses. And a lot of my wages was based on commission, which sounds really horrid, but it was. And so I'd worked out this kind of pattern of, because they would have to fill out this form in this salon, in this boutique. They'd come in and it would be like your job, your kind of age, where you're going to get married, which had the south of France, which I always found really weird, like you could circle it, but it was a big thing. And I started to see kind of a relationship between these kind of, demographic information and the type of wedding dresses that they were choosing. So I thought, wow, I'm going to use this to my advantage and sell wedding dresses. And I actually became like the top selling wedding dress assistant at the time. And even the manager said, how are you doing this? Like, this isn't, how are you doing this? You should come and train the other people. And I was thinking, well, unless you've got a sociology degree, I don't know how you're going to do this. But yeah, so so obviously my sole purpose there was to sell wedding dresses. But once I kind of realised that there was this kind of aesthetic judgment of wedding dresses related to kind of social class, occupation, age, I drew upon it and I used it. And at the same time, I realised, actually, do you know what? And I spoke to the manager and she said, it's fine, as long as we're anonymous and no one knows and blah, blah, blah. I could produce a paper out of this. I could produce, a kind of valuable data for kind of sociological exploration of class, aesthetics, taste and wedding dresses. And so I wrote a paper on it. I presented it at a conference and I'm very grateful to the editors of the book to invite me to write a paper for it. And it kind of explored consumption, taste and class antagonisms in an era of variety and choice. And what I was kind of interested in is the symbolic struggle over the right to define what counts as good taste. So again, I'm bringing Bourdieu into that again because he actually wrote about the very high-end French boutiques in the 1960s, 70s. So he wrote a paper on that, and I draw upon that. And so I kind of argued that the bride's expression of their aesthetic preferences was often defined in opposition to others. So, you have I classified the dresses into 4 different classifications. And even though it was exclusive, so the wedding dresses ranged from kind of 1,000 to 4,000 in exclusive boutique, you would have brides that would come in and they would say, they would call them the chavvy dresses, and those types of discourses. Or you would have more kind of working class brides who had money to spend on a expensive dress, saying about the very high end dresses, which didn't look like a wedding dress, for example. They looked like a nightgown or an evening gown, and they would just say, no, it doesn't look like that's something I would wear on a night out. And so often it was defined in opposition to others. But what I found is the people with the most power and the most money would do that much more. And I kind of, it also looked at kind of concerns and anxiety about finding the right dress, and this kind of being influenced by an expanding wedding industry, media, social media and television in particular, within a kind of a post-feminist neoliberal discourse. It was really just how the bride made a choice of the wedding dress.
Yeah.
How they did, and I found it was very related to social class.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like the anxiety came of walking up the aisle, and what that experience was when they walk up the aisle and everyone's looking at them. It's not about their dress; it's about their aesthetic tastes. It's about their class. It's about who they're saying they're belonging to, where they fit in. Because everyone just judges the bride on her dress. Well, I'd like to think I wouldn't, but this is the kind of perception. I mean, you just look at the royal weddings and you see what happens there. So it was more about kind of how the choice of dress would often be linked to different social classes.
Yeah. So I suppose that also brought in some feminist ideas as well as Marxist ideas, and the kind of the pressure.
Exactly, and particularly kind of post-feminism, where we're kind of seen as rejecting the idea of being a feminist,
Yeah.
and all of it being all about choice and consumption. But at the same time, what happens is we're kind of defined or we're being judged by these choices at the same time. So it produces a lot of anxiety about being a woman in society.
So, Jenny, tell us about your current research that you're doing. Another ethnographic piece of research.
Yeah, and again, I came across this by chance. It just so happened I walked into a pub. I love pubs, I miss them. And I was speaking to the landlord there, and he's Irish. He kind of said, "Oh, you are you from an Irish background?" And it turned out I wasn't, and I lived locally. And he said, "Are you interested in?" I'm looking for barmaids at the moment. And I said, I'll be honest, I've got no experience at all, but I have worked in shops, and I am, I could do with the extra money. It was just all over Christmas. So I took the job there. And then again, I took the job because I thought, it's a bit of extra cash. But then I realised again, hang on a minute, this could make a really interesting study. So I was interested in kind of examining the experience of being a woman working in the pub, because it's a very masculine type environment, and particularly within, again, a post-feminist neoliberal society. And so for a while I was exploring that, and I kind of saw that class again became essential to aesthetic labour. And barmaids were expected to have this kind of feminine self-presentation. We were also expected to have the right type of labour, because I should say that although it's a mixed clientele within the pub, it's in a very affluent area, which is something you get common in London. So you'll get very kind of disadvantaged areas next to very wealthy areas. And so what you'll have people coming from the disadvantaged areas into the more affluent areas and doing the service sector jobs there. And so again, I saw this kind of what I saw in the bridal boutique of kind of tasteful consumptions. And I have some classic stories in the early days of where I couldn't pronounce the wines correctly. I didn't know what wines they had, all these different types of things. I went home and I learned it. I even learned the region the wines came from. I was so like, I'm not gonna suffer this. And again, how like kind of that barmaids were kind of judged on their appearance as well, and often how as women they're kind of used within a conflict resolution resource in an alcohol-infilled environment, where friction can break out, and women were often seen as the kind of dispersers of the friction, if that makes sense, kind of, so that's originally what I was doing, but coronavirus happened. And so on the 20th of March, and I have done so I'm writing a paper at the moment where I'm actually doing an unfolding. So it's an unfolding ethnography of the week leading up to the pub closures, because we all knew it was going to happen. It's all I can only think. So on the 20th of March, I stood in the room, because I've been living at this pub as well. So I stood in the room above the pub, watching Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the UK, state live on TV, we are telling cafes, pubs, bars and restaurants to close tonight and not to open tomorrow. That was 5 o'clock on Friday, the 20th of March. We had no warning or anything. And I stood there and I was like, oh no, this is terrible. It needed to be done, but we didn't know at this point, what kind of coverage we were going to have or anything. But we'd also kind of knew that we were leading up to this situation, because what was very irresponsible, I think, was I'll take, for example, 3 days before St. Patrick's Day, which was the 17th of March, and someone who was doing an ethnography in a London Irish pub. This was the biggest day of the year. And a lot of effort for months had gone into planning this, but they kept the pubs open, yet they told the public, don't go to the pubs. So I kind of, I know. So I'm doing this kind of unfolding ethnography of what was happening. Also, some of the comments, like, the stuff that was being said in the pubs about coronavirus is very interesting in itself. So I'll be exploring a bit more about that. I've continued, so just make it clear, I'm not broken any kind of lockdown rules.
Yeah.
I continue to live here during lockdown because obviously lockdown happened. I was due to go back home on the Monday, and then Boris Johnson came on and said, we're locking down the country. So this was 3 days after the pubs are closed. So I continue to stay here because and I think this is very interesting in terms of like what kind of ethnography you are, but part of me being an ethnographer in these environments is not just to come in and take research and take from these communities and leave them and write a paper and never speak to them again. I'd like to help them, and I'd like, if they want it, if they ask me for help, I will help. So using my experience, perhaps my more academic experience of kind of navigating the schemes and systems that are available there to help them. So I've stayed here. It's really nice. I get time to write and stuff, like do my own stuff, but also helping the kind of the publican who, doesn't even have a laptop, doesn't know how to apply for these coronavirus loans. So I've been helping the pub kind of navigate this, the furlough system, everything.
Yeah.
And so I'm continuing the ethnography in that way, showing the kind of pressures that the hospitality industry, the conflicting messages that are going out, and a survival of an independent pub, which was already struggling in a pandemic or a recession that we've not experienced like this for 100 years. And so I think it kind of offers an insight into, what happens when there's a crisis, what happens when, not everything runs smoothly in your research and actually something does break. I mean, this is the most serious example, but often I think it's the experience as a sociologist to adapt to this. We are there to study society, we are there to study what's happening. And so yes, I was studying aesthetic labour of being a working class barmaid, but actually a global pandemic has happened. The hospitality industry has been severely affected. So I'm going to shift. I'm not an opportunist. I'm just a sociologist. I'm going to shift, and I'm going to tell these people's stories, and I'm going to tell what's happening.
I totally agree. I mean, that's what good sociology is. You're kind of embracing the reality rather than saying that's the end of the research.
Responsive, right? Yeah. You're happening. You're responsive to what's happening in society, and it's not about jumping on anything. It's about actually telling people's stories and capturing it in time. And if sociologists aren't there to tell people's stories and capture them and do ethnographies and say what's happening to the general public, the working class people, those suffering the most severe forms of inequality under what's the coronavirus and regulations, restrictions, everything, who is going to be there? Who is going to be there?
I really hope, Jenny, that you're going to also track and monitor that first night where we're allowed back in the pub. I just wonder what that's going to be like.
Oh yeah, I've already got some lovely notes on that.
Thank you, Jenny. That's really great. For those people that perhaps want to learn more about you, you've mentioned your Twitter account, but where else can people read blogs or more about your work, please?
So obviously I've started this new blog, which is called Sociologists Left to Their Own Devices. So I'll be posting a lot more about my research on there as well. I've written, I was co-editor of a book called Bourdieu, The Next Generation, because I was actually a co-convener of the British Sociological Association's Bourdieu Study Group and a founder, actually co-founder of the group, and I convened that for 6 years. So it's a great book because it's about making Bourdieu accessible, and it's an edited collection where you look at different examples of applying Bourdieu as an early career researcher as well. Lisa Mackenzie's in there, so she's got a chapter called Bringing Bourdieu to the Council Estate. Yeah. So yeah, I just hope that perhaps I've got more work coming, and that will be produced on the blog.
Great, thanks, Jenny, and look forward to that first glass of wine when the pub's back open.
I need to experience.
Thank you very much for your time today, Jenny.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.